We have been looking at the arc of the Bible, the storyline, and how we understand that. And last week we were looking at Matthew. Anybody remember what the theme of Matthew was? Theology, yeah. Generations. There was something about generations in there. What was the key word we used? Outsiders. Remember? Outsiders. We looked at Matthew and we looked at the idea that Matthew, who was a tax collector, was a disenfranchised Jew. He wasn't very happy with his Judaism and he became a tax collector. But out of being a tax collector, God called him to be one of the first 12 apostles. And he wrote to the Jews to say, I was an outsider welcomed in. And all of the story of the Bible is about outsiders being welcomed into the family of God. And we looked at the genealogy of all those people who were outside. We looked at magi and astrologers, people on the outside coming in. We looked at the ones who were on the inside, thought they were doing okay, and they were actually on the outside. And we looked at the idea that all the way through Matthew, he constantly is saying, if you're an outsider, you are welcome inside. Now we're looking at Mark. Mark's a little bit different. Mark, again, is a Jew, but he's a second-generation Jew. He's the cousin of Barnabas. He travelled around with Paul. He got in trouble at one stage. But he writes, I believe, to the Gentiles in Rome. He's writing to the very centre of empire. Remember, we've been talking about these two storylines in the Bible. Empire, power, authority, shalom, peace and justice. And he's writing to the very people right in the middle of empire. Now, I don't know if you know much about Mark, but it's the shortest of the Gospels. It's about only a small percentage of the size of the other Gospels. And it's a very fast-paced book. As you read through it, it constantly says, immediately Jesus went here. Immediately he healed. Immediately. It's written to an audience that were very fast-paced in their thinking. They wanted their story, they wanted it short. They want the synopsis. They're not a Jewish gospel. In Judaism, when you tell a story, you tell the level, but there's a whole lot of depth underneath as well. And people have got to search for the depth. But if you're talking to a Roman or a Western, we're kind of the lineage of Rome and Greece. If you're a Western person, you want the short version of the Bible. You want the story bang, bang, bang. And it looks at what are called the pillars of Hellenism. These are the key themes that were going through Greek and Rome culture of the day. And he's going to look at each of these, particularly when it comes to the crucifixion. And he includes some unnecessary thoughts to kind of connect it to Rome. Have a look at this. Right in the middle of the crucifixion, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon. Okay, he mentions the guy's name. That makes sense. The father of Alexander and Rufus. Right in the middle of the crucifixion whole thing, why does he mention the father of these two boys? Makes no sense. Until you go into Rome, into the book of Romans, where in about the 50s, Paul wrote to the Romans, and he says, Greek Rufus. One of the guys in Rome is Rufus. Mark is writing probably later on, a decade later on, and he wants to connect with the Gentile people, so he mentions one of the people who had gone to Rome, Rufus and Alexandra, the sons of Simon. Imagine when they received the book of Mark, and they were reading it, and they said, oh, Rufus, it mentions your name. I didn't know your father was the guy that carried Jesus' cross. And so he connects it right into the Roman people of the day. So we think that's probably written to the Romans. And when you have a look at the pillars of Hellenism, you start to understand why Mark wrote the way that he wrote. They had four things that they used to convey culture. There was education, healthcare, entertainment and sports. Look at those today. Think about our culture today. Most of our culture revolves around education, healthcare, entertainment and sports. I don't know if any of you were watching the great game yesterday where Auckland FC won the game in penalties at the end. And I want to turn the TV off because I can't handle penalties. And there's a big shootout and we win the game. It's so exciting to get involved in sport at some point. In Roman culture, these things were really important. But Mark is saying, if you think the good life comes from our health system, if you think it comes from our education, our media, or our sport, you've missed the point. You're buying into the Roman myth, because they are not ultimately what the good life is from. He looks at Jesus, and all the way through Mark, he says things about Jesus that equate to Jesus being better than the pillars of Hellenism. He says he's the greatest teacher. Mark described as an authoritative teacher. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one had authority. He's saying to the Roman kind of people, if you think your teaching is good, look at the teaching of Jesus. He is a superior teacher. He's saying to the people who went to I can't say that word, Asclepian, that word. Luke, the writer of Luke, is a medical doctor. He was probably a priest who operated in that environment. Okay, we're going to look at that next week. But he says, you go along to your healers, but Jesus is the greatest healer. He's not just dealing with the body, he's dealing with the whole person. He says, you Romans, you guys like entertainment. Look at what the Jewish people were like. When Jesus was preaching, they flocked out to see Jesus as though he was entertainment. But he's actually going to say he's better than entertainment. And then he says, you Romans, you like a good champion. You like people to fight your battles in the arena. Jesus is going to be the better champion. All the way through Mark, he keeps on saying, you think Caesar is good, Jesus is better. He actually meets your needs more. And see, this is why we mentioned last week, some people get into the harmonising of the Gospels and you look at the differences between the Gospels and you're getting the wrong point, because every writer has a particular agenda they're going for. Matthew's saying, if you're an outsider, you're welcome in. Mark is saying, if you're part of the Roman culture and you're depending on all these pillars of Hellenism, look at Jesus, because he's better than every one of those. Just look at one of the examples of one of the distinctives between the Gospels, okay? In Matthew and Mark, they have the wine given to Jesus twice, before the crucifixion and after the crucifixion. All of the Gospels have it while he's on the cross. Interestingly, where it says the wine vinegar on the cross and it says they handed it to him with a sponge, don't think of a normal sponge. Think about somebody's toilet paper discarded on the side of the road. They've picked up the toilet paper, they've soaked it in and they've handed it to Jesus. That's what they really mean by the sponge. It's kind of people's dirty things that they used to clean their bum with that was handed up to Jesus. But in Matthew and Mark, it talks about before he's crucified. So there's an error in the Bible, obviously, because some of the Gospels say twice and some of them say one. No, you're missing the point of what he's aiming for. Look at the difference even between Matthew and Mark. Wine to drink mixed with gall, wine mixed with myrrh. Why is there a difference? Well, Mark has a very particular reason why there's a difference. We're going to come to that in just a minute. But Mark is saying Jesus is King and Lord. But you Romans live in a culture where Caesar is Lord. And are you willing to do the difference? Now, what Mark does is he looks at the coronation of an emperor. If you coronate an emperor, Nero in 52, about when Mark was written, okay? There are 9 stages that an emperor goes through. I wonder if you recognise some of these. The Praetorian Guard come together, they dress him in a purple robe, they go for a procession with a bull, they have the person who's going to be the executioner next to him, they go up the hill, he pours wine and myrrh that he doesn't take. He's then set between 2 people, and they call him Caesar and Lord, and then a miracle happens. These are the 9 stages of a normal emperor. Have a look what Mark does here. This is astounding. The soldiers led Jesus away to the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of the soldiers, lining up with the first one of those. Then it says, they put a purple robe on him, twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him, and they began to call him, Hail, King of the Jews. Can you see what Mark is doing? Mark is aligning the coronation of the emperor with the coronation of King Jesus. Procession through Rome, and when they'd mocked him, they took off his purple robe and put on his own clothes on him, and they led him out to be crucified. And a certain man called Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on the way, and they forced him to carry the cross. And they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. Now this is where the stories deviate a little bit. They both have them going up a hill, but one of them has them going up the hill in the middle of the city, the power place, and the other one takes Jesus outside of the city and has him going up a hill at Golgotha. Same events, but 2 very, very different ideas underlying this. And then they gave him wine with myrrh, then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. The reason Mark uses myrrh is that what was the emperor did. He took very, very expensive wine that was used as a narcotic, and he poured it out before he took it. And that's exactly what it described in Mark. And they crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Have you always ever wondered why there were 3 of them up there? Was it just by chance? No, because it was meeting the coronation event of the emperor, to have one person on either side of him. And then they finish, or almost finish. This is another bit where it separates a little bit. For Caesar, they say, Hail Caesar, Lord and God. And Mark, it says, those who passed him hurled insults at him. We worship the Caesar, but we deny the Jesus. And then it finishes with meant to be an event, an omen happens. And we are told in the story that the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And there were 2 curtains, by the way. One really, really thick one, and one that was used right on the outer court to show the Roman authority. And they were ripped in 2. And it was a centurion who stood there in front of Jesus and saw how he died, and he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Mark was taking with irony, saying the one who recognised who Jesus was the soldier from Empire. The one who recognised Shalom was the one who came from Empire. Mark is very, very carefully arguing that Jesus is Lord. And then right at the end of Mark, I don't know if you've got a Bible that says right at the end of Mark, some verses end here, and then there's an extra little bit that's not in the original version. What people don't like is how it ends in the original version. The oldest manuscripts we have, and the most common ending, ends like, trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. It's a funny way to end a gospel. But if you're writing to Romans, the whole world has been turned upside down. Do I choose Caesar or do I choose Jesus? My whole world is turned upside down. If I follow the way of Jesus, the way, I'd be trembling and bewildered. I'd be wondering what is happening to my world. And so we come in Mark to recognise that Jesus is the better king. But unless you are bewildered and trembled by that, I don't think you've kind of got who Mark is saying Jesus is. This is not just somebody we come and get our backs patted on and said, oh, you're a good person and, God loves you. This is somebody who says your life is mine. Your assets are mine, your time is mine, all of your resources, all you have is mine. And if you don't tremble at that idea, you haven't got what he's asking for. But he is saying it's the better way. The world offers 4 pillars to have the good life, but Jesus is the better way. I'm going to invite our musos to come up and just lead us in our very last song together called The Last Hymn. But let me just remind you of our commitment prayer and just one of the lines in it. It says, I commit to you as Lord of my life. Lord is not an easy thing. Lord is saying it's all yours and I'm going to walk with you. So as we sing our last song this morning, I pray that you would really turn to God and say, you are the Lord of my life. Let's enjoy this last song together.